Tollund men. You're crouched in the peat bog outside Tollund, Denmark, May 8th, 1950. The dark earth gives way under your shovel. Something catches the light. Leather, no, skin. A face emerges from the peat. Eyes closed. Expression peaceful. The rope is still around his neck. Your hands shake as you brush away 2,000 years of compressed moss and sediment. This isn't a skeleton. This is a man. His stubble is visible. His fingerprints intact. The leather cap sits perfectly on his head, as if he lay down to sleep yesterday. But the noose tells a different story. Someone wanted him dead. Someone took great care in killing him. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Professor Peter Wilhelm Glob of Aarhus University led the excavation, documenting every detail in his 1965 publication, The Bog People. Tollund Man wasn't alone. Over the following decades, more than 2,000 bog bodies emerged from the peat across northern Europe. Graubaul Man, Lindo Man, the Windeby Girl, each one preserved with impossible perfection by the acidic, oxygen-free environment of the bogs. Here's what makes this impossible to dismiss as simple murder. The Silkeborg Museum's forensic analysis revealed Tollund Man died between 400 and 200 before the Common Era. His last meal was a gruel of barley, linseed, and dozens of wild seeds, consumed 12 to 24 hours before death. The rope around his neck was braided from 2 leather thongs. His throat had been cut. But here's the critical detail. He was placed in the bog immediately after death, positioned with deliberate care, his limbs arranged in a fetal position. Carbon dating confirmed similar patterns across dozens of bog bodies. The Graubaul Man, discovered in 1952, showed evidence of having his throat slashed from ear to ear. The Lindo Man, found in 1984 in Cheshire, England, had been struck twice on the head, strangled with a sinew cord, and had his throat cut, what researchers termed overkill. Yet forensic anthropologist Don Brothwell of the University of York noted in his 1986 study that many bog bodies showed signs of manicured nails and soft hands, suggesting high social status. The mainstream explanation centers on ritual sacrifice during the Iron Age. Archaeological evidence points to the Celtic and Germanic practice of offering valuable goods to the gods by depositing them in sacred water sources. Professor Miranda Aldhouse-Green of Cardiff University argues in Bog Bodies Uncovered that these individuals were sacrificial offerings to fertility deities, their deaths timed to seasonal agricultural cycles. The careful positioning, the remote bog locations, the evidence of repeated ritual elements all support organized religious practice. But the evidence resists neat categorization. Why were some bog bodies bound while others lay free? Why do some show evidence of torture while others appear to have died peacefully? Chemical analysis of stomach contents reveals wildly different final meals. Some ate elaborate porridges, others consumed nothing but ergot-contaminated grain that would have induced hallucinations. Most puzzling, isotope analysis by the University of Copenhagen shows many bog bodies lived far from where they died, suggesting they traveled great distances specifically to meet their fate. Some researchers suggest these weren't standard sacrifices, but executions of criminals or outcasts, their bodies placed in bogs to prevent their spirits from returning. Others propose they were willing participants in shamanic death rituals, seeking transformation through drowning in sacred waters. Dr. Karen Margareta Frey of the National Museum of Denmark published findings in 2015 showing several bog bodies wore clothing from across Europe, implying international significance to their deaths. The timeline deepens the mystery. Bog body discoveries span over 1,500 years, from 500 before the Common Era to 1,000 Common Era. This wasn't a brief cultural practice, but a persistent tradition maintained across centuries of political upheaval, migration, and changing religious systems. Was Tollund Man a volunteer seeking divine transformation? A criminal receiving the ultimate punishment? A foreign dignitary offered in diplomatic sacrifice? Why preserve the method of execution so carefully in the archaeological record? What did these ancient peoples believe happened to consciousness after such elaborate ritual death? The bogs of Northern Europe weren't the only places where ancient peoples practiced inexplicable ritual killing. The Carthaginian Tophet. You hear the wailing first. It cuts through the Mediterranean night like broken glass. You're standing in the sacred precinct of Tanit, goddess of fertility and death, in the heart of ancient Carthage. The year is 650 before the Common Era. Smoke rises from bronze braziers. Priests in purple robes move between rows of stone markers. Each marker bears the same dedication. To the Lady Tanit and to Lord Baal Hammon. Beneath your feet lie thousands of urns. Each urn holds cremated bones. Each set of bones once belonged to an infant. The discovery came in 1921 when French archaeologist Francis Kelsey of the University of Michigan began systematic excavations in the Salambo district of modern Tunisia. What his team uncovered defied immediate classification. Layer upon layer of burial urns, some stacked 10 deep, containing the cremated remains of newborns and young children. By 1975, archaeologist Lawrence Stager of Harvard University had documented over 20,000 burial urns across multiple Carthaginian sites. His findings, published in the American Journal of Archaeology in 1982, revealed the largest collection of infant cremation burials ever discovered in the ancient world. The scale is staggering. The Carthaginian Tophet spans nearly 6 acres. Carbon dating places the earliest burials at 730 before the Common Era, continuing until the Roman destruction of Carthage in 146 before the Common Era. That's 584 years of continuous infant burials. Stager's analysis of bone fragments showed that 65% of the remains belonged to infants under 1 month old. The remaining 35% were children between 1 month and 4 years of age. Here's what makes this impossible to ignore. The demographics don't match natural mortality patterns. In ancient populations, infant mortality typically peaked in the first week of life, then declined sharply. But the Carthaginian Tophet shows the opposite pattern. The highest concentration of remains comes from infants aged 2 to 4 months, precisely when natural mortality rates should be dropping. Additionally, isotope analysis by Jeffrey Schwartz of the University of Pittsburgh, published in Antiquity in 2010, revealed that many of the cremated infants showed signs of prenatal stress consistent with ritual preparation. The mainstream explanation is that these represent child sacrifice, specifically the Moloch ritual described by Roman historians. Plutarch wrote that Carthaginian parents would place their infants in the bronze arms of a statue of Baal Hammon, which would then tip forward, dropping the children into flames below. Diodorus Siculus claimed that during times of crisis, Carthaginian nobles would sacrifice their firstborn to appease the gods. Roman sources consistently describe these practices as barbaric rituals designed to secure divine favor through the ultimate offering. But some researchers suggest an alternative interpretation. Anthropologist Patricia Smith of Hebrew University, in her 2013 study published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology, argues that the Tophet represents a specialized cemetery for infants who died of natural causes. She points to similar practices in other ancient cultures, where deceased infants were cremated and buried in sacred spaces to ensure their souls reached the afterlife. The apparent demographic anomaly, Smith suggests, could result from selective burial practices. Only certain categories of naturally deceased infants received Tophet burial, while others were interred elsewhere. The problem is, the evidence doesn't cleanly support either interpretation. If these were natural deaths, why do bone fragments show evidence of ritual preparation? Why do inscriptions specifically request divine favor in exchange for offerings? Why do the demographic patterns contradict known infant mortality curves? Conversely, if these were sacrifices, why do some remains show signs of disease that would make them unsuitable offerings? Why would supposedly voluntary sacrifices cluster during specific seasonal periods rather than during documented crises? The most disturbing discovery came in 2014. Chemical analysis of residue found in bronze vessels associated with the urns revealed traces of opium and other sedatives. This suggests the infants may have been drugged before death, but whether to ease natural passing or facilitate sacrifice remains unclear. What drove parents to place their children in these bronze arms? Why do the bones tell contradictory stories? How many civilizations have we misunderstood because only their enemies wrote their history? What other practices have we condemned without understanding their true meaning? Half a world away, in the desert kingdoms of Rajasthan, stone memorials tell another story of ritual death, one where the choice was made by those who died. The sati stones of Rajasthan. You smell the sandalwood oil before you see the flames. The procession winds through narrow streets in 14th century Jodhpur. Drums beat, women wail. But one woman walks in perfect silence toward the funeral pyre where her husband's body waits. She wears her wedding sari. Flowers crown her hair. Her face shows no fear, no hesitation. She climbs onto the pyre willingly. The flames rise. Within hours, stonemasons begin carving her memorial. This scene repeated across India for over 14 centuries. Today, more than 4,000 carved sati stones dot the landscape of Rajasthan alone. Each one commemorates a woman who chose to burn alive rather than live as a widow. The practice spans from approximately 400 to 1800 Common Era, leaving behind one of archaeology's most disturbing puzzles. Dr. Lindsay Harlan of Connecticut College documented over 2,000 sati stones during her fieldwork between 1985 and 1995. Her seminal work, Religion and Rajput Women, published in 1994, remains the most comprehensive study of these memorials. Each stone follows precise iconographic rules. The woman appears with her husband, often on horseback. Sanskrit inscriptions record her name, her family lineage, the exact date of her death. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. These weren't hasty monuments to tragedy. They were planned, elaborate celebrations. The British East India Company recorded detailed accounts of sati ceremonies they witnessed in the 18th century. Captain James Todd, the British resident in Rajasthan from 1818 to 1822, documented over 50 sati ceremonies in his Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. His descriptions are clinical, horrifying, and precise. The women showed no signs of coercion, no evidence of drugs, no indication of madness. They performed complex rituals, blessed their families, and walked into the flames with what observers consistently described as serene determination. Here's what makes this impossible to explain. The practice wasn't confined to grief-stricken widows in emotional crisis. Archaeological evidence shows sati occurred across all social classes, all ages, and even when husbands died of old age after long marriages. Some women were pregnant, others had young children who needed care. The inscriptions record women who had been widowed for months or even years before choosing sati. This wasn't impulsive desperation. It was systematic, ritualized, and voluntary. The mainstream explanation focuses on social pressure and patriarchal control. Widows in medieval India faced severe restrictions, property loss, and social ostracism. Sati offered an escape from a life of poverty and disgrace, while elevating the woman to goddess-like status. The ritual provided families with honor and often significant donations from the community. Economic incentives, combined with religious beliefs about purification and reunion with deceased husbands in the afterlife. But the stones themselves contradict this explanation. Dr. Harlan's analysis of inscription data reveals that wealthy widows with property rights and family support chose sati at the same rates as destitute ones. Women from families that actively discouraged the practice still proceeded. Most puzzling, many stones commemorate women who possessed what medieval sources describe as exceptional independence and authority within their households. These weren't powerless victims seeking escape. They were women with options who deliberately chose death. The ritual procedures recorded in contemporary texts add another layer of mystery. The Dharmashastra literature describes elaborate preparation periods lasting weeks or months. The woman underwent purification ceremonies, distributed her possessions, and received visitors who sought her blessings. Communities treated her as a living goddess during this period. She possessed the power to grant wishes, forgive debts, and curse enemies. Why would someone with temporary divine authority choose to surrender it for death? Archaeological excavations at sati sites reveal additional anomalies. Dr. Ramila Thapar's research team from Jawaharlal Nehru University found evidence of elaborate underground chambers beneath some sati stones. These contained offerings, jewelry, and religious artifacts, suggesting ongoing veneration for centuries after the woman's death. The investment of resources and sustained devotion indicates these weren't simply memorials to tragic deaths, but active pilgrimage sites dedicated to powerful spiritual figures. What psychological mechanism could sustain such a practice across 14 centuries and thousands of individual choices? How did entire communities normalize and celebrate what amounts to ritualized suicide? Why do the stones show no evidence of the coercion that would explain such widespread participation? What did these women believe they were achieving that made death preferable to life? How did medieval Indian society create conditions where burning alive became not just acceptable, but spiritually desirable? The British would soon encounter another culture that practiced ritualized death for religious purposes, though in a very different landscape across the seas. The Druids of Anglesey. You smell the salt wind carrying something else. Smoke, blood. The screams echoing across the Menai Strait in 60 Common Era aren't human anymore. There's something primal, ancient. You're Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, and your legions have just landed on Anglesey, the sacred island of Mona. What you see in those oak groves will haunt Roman riders for centuries. The Druids move between the trees like shadows. The robes are dark with stains you don't want to identify. Bodies hang from branches, some still moving. The altars are slick with offerings that steam in the cold Welsh air. Your soldiers hesitate. These aren't just priests. They're something Rome has never encountered before. The historical record comes to us through Roman historians who witnessed the systematic destruction of the Druidic stronghold. Tacitus, writing in his annals around 109 Common Era, provides the most detailed account of Paulinus's campaign against the Celtic priesthood. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History completed in 77 Common Era, describes ritual practices that involved human sacrifice on a scale that shocked even Romans accustomed to gladiatorial games. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, corroborates these accounts with additional details about the sacred groves and their bloody altars. Archaeological investigations on Anglesey have been extensive. Professor Barry Cunliffe of Oxford University led excavations throughout the 1980s and 90s, publishing his findings in The Ancient Celts in 1997. Teams from Bangor University conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys across suspected Druidic sites between 2000 and 2010. The National Museum of Wales has catalogued over 2,000 Celtic artifacts recovered from the island. Every survey technique available to modern archaeology has been employed. Here's what makes this impossible. No physical evidence of the massive human sacrifice operations described by Roman sources has ever been found. The Romans wrote about groves filled with human remains, about regular ritual killings involving hundreds of victims, about sacred pools where Druids drowned captives as offerings to their gods. Tacitus specifically mentions altars soaked with the blood of prisoners and groves devoted to savage superstitions. Yet 40 years of intensive archaeological work on Anglesey has produced virtually no human remains associated with ritual activity. The mainstream explanation is that the Romans systematically destroyed all evidence of Druidic practices during their occupation. The accounts of human sacrifice were likely exaggerated for propaganda purposes, portraying the Celts as barbaric savages who needed Roman civilization. Any ritual remains would have been cleared away, burned, or scattered by the legions as they dismantled the Druidic power structure. But the math doesn't support this. The Romans described sacrifice operations that would have required thousands of victims over decades. Bone doesn't simply vanish. Even cremated remains leave traces that survive in soil chemistry for millennia. Modern forensic archaeology can detect evidence of mass killings from trace amounts of phosphate deposits and microscopic bone fragments. The complete absence of such evidence across multiple excavation sites suggests either the Roman accounts were entirely fabricated, or the Druids possessed methods of disposing of human remains that left no archaeological signature whatsoever. Some researchers suggest the rituals took place entirely in natural settings that wouldn't preserve evidence. water sacrifices in tidal pools that would wash remains out to sea, exposure platforms where bodies were left for carrion birds, similar to Tibetan sky burial practices, cremation techniques that achieve temperatures hot enough to completely consume bone, a practice that requires sophisticated knowledge of combustion chemistry. Dr. Anne Ross, the leading Celtic scholar at the University of Edinburgh, published findings in 1967 suggesting that Druidic rituals may have involved spiritual rather than physical sacrifice. Her analysis of Celtic mythology indicates that Roman observers may have misinterpreted symbolic death and rebirth ceremonies as literal killings. But this explanation struggles with the specificity of Roman descriptions and the fact that multiple independent sources describe the same practices. The groves of Anglesey keep their secrets buried beneath centuries of Christian sanctification and Roman concrete. Carbon dating of peat bog samples from suspected ritual sites shows unusual spikes in charcoal deposits around 60 Common Era, consistent with massive fires. But whether these fires consumed evidence of human sacrifice or simply marked the end of Druidic power remains unknown. What kind of rituals could consume all trace of their victims? How did an entire religious system vanish without leaving physical evidence? Were the Romans describing something they genuinely witnessed, or something they needed to believe? What secrets did those sacred groves hold that couldn't survive contact with Roman steel? Even older mysteries await in the hills of Turkey, where skulls arranged in patterns suggest rituals that predate the Druids by thousands of years. The school cult of Gobekli Tepe, you're kneeling in the pre-dawn darkness, your hands working methodically with obsidian blades sharper than any modern scalpel. The skull in your lap is still warm. Around you, dozens of other figures move in ritualistic precision, each tending to their own harvests from the night's ceremony. The massive stone pillars loom overhead, carved sentinels weighing 14 tons each, their surfaces alive with serpents, scorpions, and vultures. This is 9,500 years before the Common Era. Agriculture hasn't been invented yet. Cities don't exist. But you are participating in something far more sophisticated than anything archaeologists believed possible for hunter-gatherers. The skulls must be prepared before sunrise. 3 careful cuts along the sagittal suture, precise scraping to remove every trace of flesh and membrane. Then, the careful carving geometric patterns that will mark these remains as sacred, as chosen, as part of something larger than individual death. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt first uncovered this impossibility at Gobekli Tepe in 1994. His team from the German Archaeological Institute spent 2 decades excavating what they initially thought was a medieval cemetery on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey. Instead, they found the world's oldest temple complex, circular stone enclosures featuring massive T-shaped pillars decorated with intricate animal carvings. Radiocarbon dating conducted by the University of Kiel placed the site's construction between 9,500 and 8,000 before the Common Era, making it 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. But it was Schmidt's colleague, Dr. Julia Gresky from the German Archaeological Institute, whose 2017 analysis in Science Advances revealed the site's most disturbing secret. Among the animal bones and stone tools, her team identified fragments of human skulls bearing unmistakable signs of ritualistic modification. The bone analysis revealed 3 distinct types of intentional alteration: deep, linear incisions made with stone tools, carefully drilled holes, and extensive scraping marks that removed all soft tissue. Gresky's forensic examination of 40 skull fragments showed these modifications occurred shortly after death, while the bone was still fresh. The precision of the cuts and the consistent patterns across multiple specimens indicated systematic, ritualistic treatment rather than random violence or cannibalism. Most significantly, the skull fragments were found deliberately placed within the sacred circles, positioned near the base of the carved pillars as if they were offerings or ritual objects. Here's what makes this impossible. The sophistication required to conceive, design, and execute such elaborate ritualistic practices predates the accepted timeline for complex religious behavior by millennia. The mainstream explanation suggests that Gobekli Tepe represents the work of semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who came together seasonally to construct and maintain the temple complex. According to this interpretation, the skull modifications represent early ancestor veneration, or warfare trophies, ritualistic practices that developed alongside the site's religious significance. But the evidence suggests something far more organized and disturbing. The skull modifications show surgical precision that implies specialized knowledge and practice technique. The consistent patterns across multiple specimens indicate standardized ritual procedures, not random experimentation, but established religious protocol. Most troubling, the sheer scale of the operation required to build Gobekli Tepe's monuments would have demanded permanent settlement and coordinated labor from hundreds of individuals, yet no evidence exists for the agricultural surplus necessary to support such a population. Dr. Gretzky's isotope analysis revealed another impossibility. The modified skulls belonged to individuals from diverse geographical regions, not local inhabitants. This suggests people traveled hundreds of miles to participate in or become subjects of these skull rituals, implying a religious influence that extended across vast territories during humanity's supposed infancy. The site's abrupt abandonment, around 8,000, before the Common Era adds another layer of mystery. The entire complex was deliberately buried under tons of soil and debris, a massive undertaking that would have required the same coordinated effort that built it. Why would a civilization capable of such sophisticated religious practices simply walk away and bury their greatest achievement? Who traveled across prehistoric landscapes to participate in these skull rituals? What religious beliefs could have motivated such surgical precision in an age before writing, agriculture, or permanent settlements? How did hunter-gatherers develop standardized ritual procedures that required specialized knowledge and coordinated execution? Why did they choose to erase their greatest achievement rather than pass it to future generations? But Gobekli Tepe's skull cult was merely humanity's opening act in the theater of ritualistic violence. The Aztec heart sacrifice. You smell copal incense, thick in your lungs. Obsidian blade catches morning light. The priest's hands move with practiced precision. One cut below the rib cage. Fingers find the space between ribs. The heart emerges still beating. Steam rises from warm blood and cool mountain air. You are witnessing Teoxahuitl at Tenochtitlan's Templo Mayor. 1519. The victim's chest cavity gapes open. Blood pools and stone channels carved specifically for this purpose. The heart continues to pulse in the priest's raised palm for nearly 30 seconds before finally stopping. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún documented these rituals in meticulous detail in his 12-volume Florentine Codex, completed in 1569. His Nahuatl-speaking informants described precise procedures. Victims climbed 114 steps to the pyramid's summit. 4 priests held the limbs while a 5th, the Tlanamakak, performed the extraction. The heart was placed in a quaxicali, an eagle vessel carved from volcanic stone. Conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo witnessed mass sacrifices at Tlatelolco in 1521, writing in his True History of the Conquest of New Spain that priests could extract a beating heart in under 15 seconds. Archaeological evidence from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History confirms the Spanish accounts. Researchers led by Leonardo Lopez Lujan have excavated over 200 sacrificial knives from Templo Mayor's foundations, each blade napped to surgical sharpness. The Aztecs called their empire Altepetl. They believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the 5th sun, our current world. Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca had torn apart the earth monster Tlaltecutli to form the land. The gods bled themselves to give humans life. This cosmic debt demanded repayment in kind. Here's what makes this impossible to fully comprehend: the theological mathematics behind the bloodshed. The Aztec ritual calendar, the Tonopolhualli, contained 260 days. Each day required specific offerings to maintain universal balance. Codex Mendoza records that Tenochtitlan alone sacrificed approximately 20,000 victims annually across all temples and ceremonies. Spanish friar Diego de Landa calculated that major festivals like Shumopi, the new fire ceremony, held every 52 years, consumed thousands of lives in a single event. The mainstream explanation focuses on political control. Historians like Ross Hassig argue that public sacrifice served to terrorize enemies and demonstrate Aztec power. The ritualized violence bound subject peoples through fear while reinforcing social hierarchies. The elaborate ceremonies showcased imperial wealth and divine sanction for Aztec rule. But this political interpretation cannot account for the precise theological requirements embedded in every aspect of the practice. Codex Borgia illustrates that different gods demanded different extraction methods. Tlaloc, the rain god, required children's tears before death. Xochiquetzal needed flayed skin worn by dancers. Tezcatlipoca's festivals demanded that victims live as gods for 1 full year before sacrifice, treated with absolute reverence. French anthropologist Christian Duverger spent 30 years analyzing Aztec cosmology at the École des Hautes and Sciences Études on Sciences Sociales. His research revealed that heart extraction wasn't random violence, but precise ritual technology. The Aztecs believed that Teolia, the soul force concentrated in the heart, literally fed the sun god Tonatiuh. Without this daily nourishment, the sun would stop moving across the sky, and the world would end in darkness. The mathematical precision troubles modern researchers. According to surviving tribute lists, the Aztec Empire encompassed approximately 15 million people across 370 tributary city-states. Yet the sacrifice numbers suggest they were consuming their population faster than it could reproduce. The demographics don't balance. Why would a sophisticated civilization risk demographic collapse for theological requirements? How did they calculate the exact number of hearts needed to keep the universe functioning? What astronomical observations convinced them that human sacrifice literally powered the sun? Why did the practice intensify as Spanish diseases decimated their population? Could their cosmic mathematics have been based on natural phenomena we no longer understand? Across the Atlantic, Celtic Druids were developing their own obsession with human heads as vessels of spiritual power. The Celtic head cult. You smell the iron tang of blood mixed with burning oak. The warrior's severed head stares at you from the stone niche, its mouth slightly open as if caught mid-scream. Around you, dozens more heads line the sanctuary walls of Rocapertus, each one carefully positioned, each one deliberately preserved. The Druids chant in a language that predates Rome, their voices echoing off limestone carved with images of birds devouring human flesh. This is southern France, around 200 before the Common Era. You are witnessing something that defies every assumption about Celtic civilization. The systematic collection and display of human heads across Celtic Europe represents one of archaeology's most disturbing puzzles. At Rocapertus, near Marseille, French archaeologist Henri de Gérin-Ricard excavated between 1924 and 1927 what he initially believed was a simple Iron Age settlement. Instead, he uncovered an elaborate sanctuary where severed heads had been carefully arranged in carved stone niches. The heads showed signs of deliberate preparation, flesh removed, eye sockets cleaned, some bearing evidence of trepanation performed after death. Dr. Jean-Louis Bruneau of the French National Center for Scientific Research documented similar findings at Ribemont-sur-Ancre in his 1999 publication, The Celtic Gauls: Gods, Rites, and Sanctuaries. The site contained over 10,000 human bones arranged in precise geometric patterns, with skulls forming distinct groupings separate from other remains. Radiocarbon dating placed the deposits between the 3rd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. At Bredon Hill in Gloucestershire, excavations led by Kathleen Kenyon in 1935 revealed a hill fort entrance decorated with human skulls mounted on wooden posts. The skulls showed cut marks consistent with careful defleshing, and some retained cervical vertebrae, suggesting they had been severed with deliberate precision. Similar discoveries emerged from Danebury in Hampshire, where Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe's excavations between 1969 and 1988 uncovered storage pits containing isolated human heads mixed with animal bones and religious offerings. The Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century, before the Common Era, recorded Celtic practices firsthand. They cut off the heads of enemies slain in battle and attached them to the necks of their horses. They embalm and cedar oil the heads of the most distinguished enemies and preserve them carefully in a chest. Archaeological evidence confirms Diodorus' account with disturbing precision. Chemical analysis of head deposits at multiple sites reveals traces of cedar oil and other preservatives. The heads were not battle trophies taken in frenzy. They were carefully curated objects of profound religious significance. The mainstream explanation suggests the Celtic head cult emerged from practical warrior culture combined with animistic beliefs about the soul's location. Scholars propose that Celts viewed the head as the seat of consciousness and spiritual power, making possession of enemy heads a way to capture their strength while preventing their spirits from seeking revenge. This interpretation aligns with similar practices documented among other warrior societies worldwide. But the archaeological evidence reveals something far more complex than simple headhunting. The systematic nature of the displays, the specialized preservation techniques, and the architectural integration of skull repositories into sacred spaces suggest a sophisticated theological framework that extended far beyond battlefield trophy taking. Professor Miranda Green of the University of Wales documented in her 1997 work, Exploring the World of the Druids, that many heads show no evidence of violent death. Some belonged to individuals who died naturally, then underwent post-mortem decapitation. Others were carefully selected based on criteria that remain completely opaque. Young adults predominate, but with no consistent pattern regarding sex, health status, or social indicators. The most puzzling aspect lies in the spatial arrangements. At Roca Pertus, heads were positioned according to astronomical alignments that correspond to Celtic seasonal festivals. At Ribaumont-sur-Ancre, skull groupings follow mathematical proportions that suggest knowledge of geometric principles not documented elsewhere in Celtic culture. Some researchers suggest these arrangements encode information about Druidical training or religious hierarchies that died with the practitioners. Why did this practice spread so uniformly across Celtic territories that had limited contact with each other? What knowledge died when the Romans systematically destroyed the Druidical class? How did Iron Age peoples develop preservation techniques that kept human heads intact for ceremonial use over extended periods? What astronomical or mathematical principles guided the precise arrangement of thousands of severed heads? The Celts were not alone in their obsession with ritualized death and the spiritual power of human remains. The Moche warrior priests. The golden chalice trembles in your hands, blood still warm, still thick. The warrior at your feet stopped breathing moments ago, his chest cavity carved open with surgical precision. Around you, the crowd chants in perfect unison, their faces painted in spirals of red ochre and black ash. The temple walls shimmer with torchlight, casting dancing shadows across murals that depict this exact scene. You lift the chalice to your lips. The metallic taste floods your mouth as the gods demand their due. You are participating in one of the most sophisticated ritual combat ceremonies ever documented in the ancient Americas. The year is approximately 400 Common Era. The place is the Huacas de Moche in northern Peru. What you've just witnessed shouldn't be possible, according to traditional archaeological models of warfare and religion. The Moche civilization flourished along Peru's northern coast from 100 to 700 Common Era. In 1987, archaeologist Walter Alva discovered the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, revealing golden artifacts of unprecedented craftsmanship. Among the grave goods were ornate chalices, ceremonial weapons, and depictions of elaborately dressed warrior priests consuming human blood. Dr. Steve Bourget's 1998 excavations at Huaca de la Luna uncovered evidence of mass ritual sacrifice, with remains of over 70 warriors found in ceremonial contexts. The murals are impossibly detailed. Room after room depicts the same ceremony. Warriors engaging in ritual combat, the defeated being sacrificed, their blood collected in golden vessels and consumed by priest kings. The iconography appears across hundreds of ceramic vessels, textiles, and wall paintings spanning 6 centuries. The consistency is absolute. Every detail matches, from the specific regalia worn by the warrior priests to the exact positioning of the sacrificial victims. Here's what makes this impossible. The Moche had no writing system, yet they maintained perfect ceremonial consistency across 600 years and thousands of square miles of territory. The murals at Huaca de la Luna show sacrifice scenes that exactly match ceramic depictions found at sites over 200 miles away. The ritual protocols depicted in artwork from 100 Common Era are identical to those shown in artifacts from 600 Common Era. Without written instructions or central religious authority, how did they maintain such precise ceremonial standards? Dr. Christopher Donan's analysis of Moche iconography, published in Moche Portraits from Ancient Peru in 1996, identified recurring figures he termed the warrior priest, the bird priest, and the priestess. These same figures appear in identical regalia across the entire Moche cultural sphere. The golden chalices found in elite burials match exactly the vessels depicted in the sacrifice scenes. Chemical analysis of these chalices, conducted by Dr. Izumi Shimada's team in 2004, revealed traces of human hemoglobin. The mainstream explanation is that the Moche developed a shared religious tradition centered on ritual combat and human sacrifice. The warrior priests likely engaged in ceremonial battles, possibly during times of environmental stress or political transition. The defeated warriors were sacrificed to ensure agricultural fertility and cosmic balance. The blood consumption represented a communion with ancestors and gods, strengthening the divine authority of the ruling class. But the archaeological evidence reveals something far more complex. The sacrifice warriors show evidence of being captured alive, transported over long distances, and kept for extended periods before sacrifice. Isotope analysis of their bones indicates they came from regions hundreds of miles from the sacrifice sites. The Moche were conducting a systematic program of warrior capture and ritual execution that required unprecedented logistical coordination across their entire civilization. Some researchers suggest the Moche developed the most sophisticated ritual warfare system in pre-Columbian America. Dr. John Verano's forensic analysis, published in War and Death in the Moche World in 2008, reveals that the sacrificial victims were elite warriors themselves, not common prisoners. Their elaborate tattoos, healed battle wounds, and high-protein diets indicate they were professional fighters of high status. The Moche weren't just killing enemies. They were sacrificing their own warrior elite in ceremonies that required their willing participation. The golden artifacts tell a story of religious theater performed on an industrial scale, yet the murals show no signs of coercion, no guards restraining victims. The warriors appear to participate voluntarily in ceremonies that would end with their deaths. The priestesses collecting their blood were expressions of reverence, not cruelty. How did the Moche convince elite warriors to participate in their own ritual execution? What religious authority could coordinate such ceremonies across centuries without written law? Why would a civilization systematically sacrifice its own military leadership? What did they believe the blood would actually accomplish? But the Moche were not alone in developing burial practices that defied rational explanation. Far to the east, another culture was creating tombs that would perplex archaeologists for entirely different reasons. The Thracian burial rites. You smell the wine before you see the dancers. Fermented grape mixed with wood smoke and something else, something that makes your stomach turn. It's 437 before the Common Era, and you're standing at the edge of a Thracian village in what will one day be Bulgaria. The celebration has been going on for 3 days now. Men leap over fires, women tear at their hair, and wail not in sorrow, but in ecstasy. They're celebrating because Codys, the warrior, is dead. You watch an old woman pour wine over his corpse while singing what sounds like a wedding song. Behind you, in the birthing hut, a newborn's first cries are met with genuine mourning. The mother weeps. The father covers his face in ash. This is the world turned upside down, and nobody can explain why. Herodotus documented these practices in his histories, written around 440 before the Common Era. The Greek historian described Thracian tribes who celebrated death as the ultimate liberation, while treating birth as the beginning of suffering. Xenophon corroborated these accounts in his Anabasis, detailing similar observations during his march through Thracian territories. Modern archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, professor emeritus at UCLA, published her seminal work, The Thracians, Their Culture and Religion, in 1974, attempting to decode these rituals through material evidence. Dr. Alexander Foll from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences spent 4 decades excavating Thracian burial sites, publishing over 60 papers between 1965 and 2005. The documentation is extensive. The understanding remains absent. The Thracians left behind elaborate tombs. The Kazanlak tomb, discovered in 1944, contains frescoes depicting funeral banquets that look more like celebrations than mourning rituals. The Sveshtari tomb, uncovered in 1982, shows carved figures in poses of ecstatic dance around a burial chamber. Dr. Diana Gergova's excavations at the Golyamata Kosmatka mound revealed burial goods that included wine vessels, musical instruments, and what appear to be carnival masks. These aren't the grave goods of a culture afraid of death. These are the tools of celebration. But here's what makes this impossible to understand. The complete absence of explanatory texts or religious documentation from the Thracians themselves. Unlike their Greek and Roman neighbors, the Thracians left no philosophical treatises explaining why death deserves celebration. No mythological cycles describing the cosmic significance of their inverted worldview. No priestly instructions detailing the proper way to mourn a birth or celebrate a death. We have only the observations of foreign visitors and the silent testimony of archaeological artifacts. The mainstream explanation suggests these rituals reflected a sophisticated philosophical understanding of existence rooted in shamanistic traditions. Some scholars propose the Thracians viewed earthly life as imprisonment, making death a release worthy of celebration. Birth, by contrast, represented the soul's entry into suffering. Dr. Foll argued this belief system connected to broader Indo-European religious concepts, particularly those found in Orphic traditions that emphasize the soul's journey between worlds. But the evidence suggests something far more complex than simple philosophical inversion. Dr. Gergova's analysis of burial remains reveals ritualistic modifications to the corpse's deliberate bone-breaking, arrangement of limbs in impossible positions, and the placement of organic materials that would have created specific scents during decomposition. Carbon dating of residue found in ceremonial vessels indicates the use of psychoactive compounds derived from local fungi. The celebrations weren't just philosophical statements about death. They were elaborate technical procedures designed to achieve specific effects nobody understands. Some researchers suggest the Thracians possessed knowledge of consciousness manipulation techniques that allowed them to experience death differently than surrounding cultures. Dr. Peter Popov's research at Sofia University indicates the ritualistic use of acoustic resonance in burial chambers, with frequencies calculated to induce altered states of awareness. The instruments found in graves weren't just for music. They were precisely calibrated tools for manipulating human perception during death ceremonies. The birth mourning remains even more mysterious. Archaeological evidence from habitation sites shows that Thracian families would fast for days after a child's birth, covering mirrors, extinguishing fires, and engaging in behaviors typically associated with death rituals in other cultures. What did they know about human existence that made life's beginning a tragedy worth mourning? Why would an entire civilization develop religious practices directly opposite to every other culture's instincts? What specific knowledge about death made celebration not just appropriate, but necessary? How did they manipulate consciousness during these ceremonies? And what did participants experience? What understanding of birth made it worthy of genuine grief? Their beliefs about death's celebration would prove tame compared to what other ancient peoples demanded of their children in the name of divine favor. Moche. The flames climb higher than the temple walls. You can feel their heat from where you stand in the crowd, pressed against hundreds of other bodies in the sacred precinct of ancient Carthage. The year is 210 before the Common Era, and Rome's legions are only days from the city gates. The bronze statue of Molech towers above you, its bull's head gleaming in the firelight, its outstretched arms glowing red-hot from the furnace burning in its hollow belly. A procession approaches through the smoke. At its center, a small figure wrapped in fine cloth moves toward the waiting god. What happens next depends entirely on who you believe. The Molech cult represents one of the most controversial religious practices in the ancient world, documented across Phoenician and Punic settlements from 1200 to 146, before the Common Era. Biblical texts, particularly Leviticus and 2 Kings, describe children being passed through the fire to Molech in ceremonies the Hebrew authors condemned as abominations. Punic inscriptions from North Africa use the term molchomor, which translators render as offering of a child. The archaeological record preserves thousands of urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young animals buried in sacred precincts called tophets, from Carthage to Sicily to Sardinia. Dr. Josephine Quinn of Oxford University's Classical Archaeology Department published her analysis of Carthaginian burial practices in the Journal of Roman Studies in 2014. Her team examined over 3,000 cremation urns from the Carthage Tophet, dating their contents using radiocarbon analysis and ceramic typology. The urns contain the burned bones of children ranging from prenatal to approximately 4 years old, often mixed with the remains of lambs and birds. Punic inscriptions on memorial stelae above the burials invoke Molech and Tanit, requesting divine favor in return for the offering. Here's what makes this impossible to resolve. The physical evidence supports multiple interpretations. The mainstream archaeological explanation is that these represent symbolic substitution rituals rather than systematic child sacrifice. Dr. Patricia Smith's osteological analysis, published in Antiquity in 2013, found that 60% of the cremated children showed signs of prenatal or neonatal death from natural causes. The Carthaginians, according to this interpretation, cremated children who died naturally and offered them to the gods as substitutes for living sacrifices. The presence of animal bones supports this theory, lambs and birds, serving as alternative offerings when human children were unavailable or the family could afford the substitution. But the inscriptions resist this comfortable explanation. The Punic texts consistently use language that distinguishes between different types of offerings: molchomor for child offerings, klil for whole burnt offerings of animals. If these were simply burials of naturally deceased children, why does the religious vocabulary treat them as distinct ritual categories? Dr. Shelby Brown's linguistic analysis in the American Journal of Archaeology in 2011 demonstrates that Carthaginian burial inscriptions for ordinary child deaths use entirely different terminology, words that emphasize mourning rather than offering. The timing patterns also complicate the natural death theory. Excavation records show clusters of child burials during periods of military crisis, including the Siege of Carthage by Agathocles in 310 before the Common Era, and the final Roman assault in 146 before the Common Era. Dr. Quinn's stratigraphic analysis reveals that these crisis periods correspond to increases in the age range of sacrificed children, extending from the usual infant demographic to children as old as 12 years. Natural mortality rates don't fluctuate this dramatically in response to political events. The Roman sources further muddy the interpretive waters. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History around 77 Common Era, claims to have witnessed Carthaginian child sacrifice firsthand during his military service. But Pliny wrote these accounts decades after Carthage's destruction, when Romans had political incentives to portray their enemies as barbaric. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, provides detailed descriptions of bronze statues with mechanical arms that drop children into furnaces, but archaeological excavations have never recovered such devices from any Phoenician site. The Tophet burials represent something that existed in the liminal space between religious offering and community mourning, between devotional practice and desperate bargaining with divine forces. The Carthaginians themselves left no theological treatises explaining their intentions, only the burned bones and the brief inscriptions requesting divine favor in return for the gift. What were these parents thinking as they approached the burning statue? Did they believe their children would live again in divine service? Were these acts of faith or desperation? Can modern archaeology distinguish between religious conviction and coercive social pressure applied by temple authorities? How do we interpret the silence of the children whose voices were consumed by flames that may or may not have been lit by their own families? These questions echo across every ritual site where ancient peoples negotiated with forces beyond their understanding through practices that defy our moral categories. Across continents and millennia, these rituals share something that defies our understanding of human nature. They were not aberrations or moments of madness. They were the sacred heart of their civilizations. The Tollan man was placed in his bog with the same reverence the Aztecs brought to their temple pyramids. The Carthaginians who fed their children to Molech did so with the same devotion the Celts showed when they placed severed heads in their shrines. These were not primitive peoples stumbling through darkness. They were sophisticated societies that chose violence as their path to the divine. What emerges from the archaeological record is a pattern that modern psychology cannot explain. These cultures developed independently across vast distances and time periods, yet they all concluded that the gods demanded blood. Not just any blood, the blood of the innocent, the blood of children, the blood of the willing. They built their entire spiritual frameworks around the belief that paradise required sacrifice, that wisdom came through suffering, that the sacred could only be accessed through acts that would horrify us today. The precision of their methods, the consistency of their practices, the careful preservation of their victims all point to something deeper than ritual murder. They point to a shared understanding of reality that we have lost completely. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that these ancient peoples knew something about the nature of existence that we have forgotten. Their willingness to pay prices we find unthinkable suggests they perceived stakes we cannot see. The bog bodies still stare at us with expressions of peace. The infant bones in the Carthaginian urns rest undisturbed. The skull towers of Gobekli Tepe watch over ceremonies we will never understand. They all whisper the same question across the centuries. What if the ancients were right about the cost of transcendence? What if the divine really does demand a price we are no longer willing to pay? What if our revulsion at their methods blinds us to truths they died to preserve?